fish and chips, cricket, red telephone boxes, all things associated with Britain. But is Britain going bust? We start by looking at the function of the government and how government finances work. A government brings in income by taxing businesses and citizens, with the income raised by the taxes used to fund public services, such as schools and hospitals. It is rare that the government revenues through taxation will equal the government spending. When the government spending is larger than the income through taxation, the budget is said to be in deficit. The government can make up the shortfall by borrowing in the financial markets, increasing government debt. To remove the deficit, the government can either increase revenues or cut spending. If we focus on the methods of increasing the revenue, there tends to be two ways to increase government income. Firstly, increasing taxes, or increasing economic output. Governments will have financial difficulty if there is a trend of widening budget deficits over time. Focusing on Britain, we are going to look at 4 key statistics that should be points of concern for the British government. These are debt to GDP, interest payments, claimant count, and labour productivity. We start with debt to GDP ratio. Now, GDP can be considered the overall wealth of the country, so this could be interpreted as a debt to income ratio. If we begin at the start of the century, the debt to GDP stood at 29.6%. Between then and 2007, the ratio stayed fairly static, with only a slight increase over the 7 years. After the global financial crisis in 2008, there was a significant increase of the ratio to 70.3%. This figure then increased over the following 9 years to 85%. After the pandemic, there's a further increase in the ratio to a staggering 97%. This is the highest the figure has been since the 1950s. The increase is driven by the significant increase in the levels of UK government debt. But why is this a bigger issue in 2024? If we look at the interest payments made by the government, this can explain the wider problem. If we look to just before the global financial crisis, the UK government paid £35 billion in interest on their debt. After the crisis, the interest payments increased to £54 billion a year. Although the government took on a large amount of debt to bail out the banks, falling interest rates mitigated some of the increase in interest expenditure. Between the financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, interest payments remained fairly flat, as any increase in interest expenditure from increasing debt levels was countered by falling interest rates. Then, in 2022, just after the COVID pandemic, the total interest expense for the government was £108 billion, more than double the cost pre-pandemic. The key driver of the increase was the fact that around 20% of UK government debt has interest rates that are linked to inflation. So, the interest paid increases when the inflation rate in the country increases. Given that inflation reached above 10% during the year, the interest expense significantly jumped. The key takeaway is that as the amount of interest paid increases, the amount of government spending will also increase, likely increasing the deficit even more. This then results in more debt needing to be issued, which then can lead to interest expenses increasing further. This cycle is something which governments need to prevent from happening. Now, a way to reduce the deficit is to increase the income the government receives. Without raising taxes, the government can increase their income when there is more economic growth. But how is economic growth achieved? Generally speaking, the economy can grow when workers produce more output from the work they do, which tends to be referred to as productivity. Or growth can be achieved if the number of people working increases. However, Britain is struggling to accomplish these goals. Firstly, let's look at the claimant counts. The claimant count is the number of people of working age while claiming job-seeking benefits. Prior to the COVID pandemic, this stood at around 1.3 million in the UK. This has increased by around 40%, close to 1.8 million. This can cause double damage to government finances, as the government is not receiving the revenue from the income tax on these potential workers, and the government has an expense to pay your out-of-work benefit. So reducing the number of people on job-seeking benefits not only helps economic growth, but also reduces the cost to the government. In addition to increasing the number of workers, economic output can also increase when workers and businesses produce more following developments in technology and infrastructure. We can see that the output per hour in the UK increased between 1997 and the global financial crisis at a strong rate. Since then, the productivity has been fairly static and hasn't improved since the pandemic. So the reduction in the workforce is not being remediated by an increase in productivity, which again limits the amount of revenue through taxation the government can receive. After looking at these trends, it is evident that the UK government should be concerned with the financials of the country, with both pressures coming from large levels of debt and a shrinking workforce. But will this result in an economic depression? Only time will tell.